The Golden State Killer's reign of terror spanned over a decade, leaving communities shattered and law enforcement baffled. His horrific crimes, 50 rapes, 13 murders, and over 100 burglaries, haunted California between 1974 and 1986. For more than 40 years, the man responsible evaded capture, until advances in DNA technology revealed the identity of a man who had lived in plain sight, hiding his monstrous nature behind the facade of an ordinary life. This is the story of Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, whose unrelenting campaign of violence left scars on victims, their families, and entire communities. The Golden State Killer's crime spree began in the 1970s, when he was first known as the East Area Rapist. His initial crimes took place in the Sacramento area, targeting middle-class neighborhoods. The attacks were meticulously planned. He would stake out his victims' homes, sometimes for days or even weeks, learning their routines. He chose single women or couples, breaking into their homes while they slept. He would shine a flashlight in their eyes, rendering them disoriented and terrified. He was ruthless in his execution, binding his victims with ligatures, using their shoelaces or items found around the house. He would place dishes on the male victims' backs, threatening to kill them if he heard a sound while he raped the women. His voice was cold and commanding. He wore a ski mask, leaving no trace of his identity. But it wasn't just his physical dominance that left a lasting impact. It was the psychological torment. After committing his crimes, he would linger in the homes, rifling through personal belongings, eating food, and taunting his victims. The terror in Sacramento reached a fever pitch as reports of the East Area Rapist's attacks dominated the news. Residents installed extra locks, bought guns, and adopted large dogs. Yet nothing seemed to stop him. His ability to elude police and continue his assaults with impunity only heightened the public's fear. By 1979, the East Area Rapist had committed over 50 rapes, but his crimes were far from over. He moved his focus south, expanding his territory and evolving into a more brutal predator. As the 1980s began, the Golden State Killer's behavior escalated dramatically. He shifted from raping women to murdering couples, earning the moniker the original Night Stalker. This phase of his criminal career was characterized by extreme violence and an utter disregard for human life. In Southern California, his first known murder occurred in December 1979, when Dr. Robert Offerman and his girlfriend Deborah Manning were found dead in their Santa Barbara home. Both had been bound, and Offerman was shot multiple times, while Manning had been raped before being killed. This marked a shift in the killer's modus operandi. He was no longer content with terrorizing his victims. He now sought to silence them permanently. Over the next several years, the body count grew. In March 1980, Lyman and Charlene Smith were found bludgeoned to death in their Ventura home. The killer had used a log from their fireplace to commit the murders, further demonstrating his willingness to use whatever means were available to complete his heinous acts. Charlene had been sexually assaulted, and both were bound with drapery cords. The sheer brutality of these crimes was unparalleled. The Golden State Killer seemed to enjoy not only the physical dominance he exerted over his victims, but also the psychological terror he left in his wake. There were whispers that he took souvenirs from the crime scenes, rings, cufflinks, anything of sentimental value. The once vibrant neighborhoods in Southern California now lived in fear, knowing the monster who had haunted the North had made his way south. Despite law enforcement's best efforts, the killer remained elusive. He had an uncanny ability to leave no clues behind, to vanish before anyone could catch a glimpse of him. At the time, forensic science was limited, and there was no DNA database that could help track him. The police were left with an ever-growing pile of cases, each more violent than the last, but no clear way to link them. The Golden State Killer was not content with simply committing his crimes. He also derived pleasure from taunting both his victims and law enforcement. In several cases, victims reported receiving strange phone calls after the attacks. The voice on the other end was eerily familiar, cold, methodical, and menacing. He would whisper, "Remember me," or breathe heavily into the phone, reigniting the terror they had fought so hard to forget. One of the most disturbing calls occurred in 1977, when a Sacramento victim received a chilling message. "Merry Christmas, it's me again." His ability to reinsert himself into the lives of his victims, even after the physical violence had ended, showcased the extent of his depravity. These calls were a way for him to reassert his control, to remind his victims that he was still out there, watching and waiting. But the killer also taunted the police. In one infamous instance, he called the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office in 1977, saying, "I am the East Area Rapist. I have my next victim already stalked, and you guys can't catch me." This brazen attitude only added to the frustration of law enforcement, who were tirelessly working to apprehend him, but always seemed one step behind. There were also moments where the police came agonizingly close to catching him. On one occasion, a couple returning home after a night out spotted a suspicious man in their neighborhood. The man fled when they confronted him, but their description of him, a white male, about 5'10", with a lean build, was consistent with earlier witness accounts. However, despite these close calls, the Golden State Killer always managed to slip away, leaving behind only fear and devastation. As the years passed, the Golden State Killer's crimes faded from the headlines, but the pain he inflicted never went away. His victims and their families continued to live with the trauma, and many wondered if the man responsible would ever be brought to justice. Little did they know that the breakthrough they so desperately sought was on the horizon. In the late 1990s, advances in DNA technology revolutionized forensic science. Cold cases that had once seemed unsolvable were now being reopened, and evidence that had been collected decades earlier could be analyzed in new ways. In 2001, DNA from several of the Golden State Killer's crime scenes was tested, and it revealed something significant. The East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person. The crimes, once thought to be the work of different individuals, were now definitively linked. This revelation reignited the investigation. Law enforcement agencies from across California began working together, sharing information and pooling resources to track down the killer. However, despite the new DNA evidence, the identity of the Golden State Killer remained a mystery. The DNA profile didn't match anyone in the national database, and without a name to go with the profile, investigators were left in the same frustrating position they had been for decades. But in 2018, everything changed. Investigators turned to a new and controversial method of DNA analysis: genetic genealogy. This technique involved uploading the Golden State Killer's DNA profile to a public genealogy database, similar to those used by people researching their family trees. By identifying distant relatives of the killer, investigators were able to narrow down their list of suspects. It was a long shot, but it worked. After painstaking research, investigators finally had a name: Joseph James DeAngelo. A former police officer, DeAngelo had worked in law enforcement during the time of the attacks, giving him both the knowledge and the resources to evade capture for so long. On April 24, 2018, DeAngelo was arrested at his home in Citrus Heights, California, just miles from where his reign of terror had begun more than 40 years earlier. The arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo shocked those who knew him. To his neighbors, he was an unremarkable man, an older retiree who lived a quiet life, tending to his lawn and keeping to himself. But behind this ordinary exterior lay a dark and violent history. D'Angelo had served in the U.S. Navy during the Vietnam War before becoming a police officer in the small town of Exeter, California. Ironically, his job was to protect and serve, yet he used his position to perfect his skills in breaking and entering. In 1979, D'Angelo was fired from the police force for shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent, items that would later be connected to his crimes. Despite his dismissal from law enforcement, D'Angelo's life continued relatively normally. He married, had 3 children, and worked as a mechanic for a grocery store chain. His family had no idea that the man they lived with was responsible for some of the most heinous crimes in California's history. When D'Angelo was arrested, he initially denied any involvement in the crimes. However, the DNA evidence was undeniable. Faced with the overwhelming proof of his guilt, D'Angelo eventually confessed to the crimes, though he did so in a way that suggested he was not fully responsible. In a bizarre and chilling moment, D'Angelo claimed that he had been controlled by an inner voice named Jerry, who had forced him to commit the murders and rapes. Joseph James D'Angelo's arrest marked the beginning of a long-awaited journey toward justice for the survivors and families of his victims. For decades, they had lived with the trauma of his unspeakable acts while he remained free. Now, with the case moving to trial, they finally had the chance to confront the man who had terrorized them for so long. However, the legal process was complex. D'Angelo was charged with 13 counts of murder, but because many of the rapes had occurred too long ago to be prosecuted under California's statute of limitations, he couldn't be formally charged for those crimes. Instead, prosecutors sought justice for the murders and burglaries, while survivors of the rapes would have the opportunity to share their stories during the sentencing phase. In June 2020, D'Angelo, facing the overwhelming evidence against him, pled guilty to the 13 murders and additional charges of kidnapping and other crimes. His plea deal spared him from the death penalty, but ensured that he would spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. The decision to accept the plea deal was made in part to avoid a lengthy and emotionally draining trial for the victims and their families, many of whom had already waited decades for closure. The sentencing hearings that followed were emotional and gut-wrenching. Over several days in August 2020, survivors and relatives of the victims were given the chance to address the court and confront D'Angelo directly. One by one, they recounted the pain, fear, and devastation he had inflicted upon their lives. They described how his crimes had torn their families apart, how they had lived in fear for years, and how the trauma of his attacks had never truly gone away. Some survivors shared their memories of the horrifying nights when D'Angelo broke into their homes, tied them up, and raped them. Others spoke of the loved ones they had lost, recounting the memories of family members who had been murdered in cold blood. In a striking display of resilience, many expressed their determination not to let D'Angelo's actions define them, emphasizing that they had found ways to move forward despite the pain. D'Angelo, seated in a wheelchair and wearing an orange prison jumpsuit, listened silently as the survivors spoke. Throughout the hearings, he showed little emotion, maintaining the same blank expression that had characterized his appearance since his arrest. He did, however, offer a brief apology during the proceedings, saying in a weak voice, "I've listened to all your statements, and I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt." For many, his apology was too little, too late. On August 21, 2020, D'Angelo was formally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, Michael Bowman, condemned him as the epitome of evil and ensured that he would never again walk free. While the sentence could not undo the damage D'Angelo had caused, it brought a measure of closure to the survivors, many of whom had feared that their tormentor would never be caught. The arrest, trial, and sentencing of Joseph James D'Angelo marked the end of one of the longest and most infamous manhunts in U.S. history. For more than 4 decades, the Golden State Killer had been a ghost, terrorizing communities from the shadows. Now, the monster had a name and a face, and justice had been served. But the legacy of his crimes endures. The survivors and the families of the victims continue to grapple with the trauma that D'Angelo inflicted upon them. For many, the fear and anxiety caused by his attacks never fully disappeared. Relationships were shattered, trust was destroyed, and the psychological scars of his crimes lingered long after the physical wounds had healed. Yet, amid the darkness, there were also stories of resilience and strength. Survivors who had been silenced for so long found their voices again during the trial, standing up to the man who had once terrorized them. Their bravery in recounting their stories in court, often decades after the attacks, was a testament to their courage and determination. In the years following D'Angelo's capture, the investigation into his crimes became a turning point for law enforcement. The use of genetic genealogy to identify him was groundbreaking and set a precedent for solving cold cases. Since D'Angelo's arrest, dozens of other unsolved cases across the country have been cracked using the same technique, providing closure for victims and their families. While genetic genealogy remains a controversial tool, particularly in terms of privacy concerns, its potential for solving violent crimes is undeniable. D'Angelo's case also brought attention to the importance of victim advocacy and the need for law enforcement to work closely with survivors. Many of the victims felt abandoned by the system in the years following the attacks, as the case languished in obscurity. The renewed focus on the victims during D'Angelo's trial highlighted the importance of giving survivors a platform and ensuring that their voices are heard. The story of the Golden State Killer is one of unimaginable horror and devastation, but it is also a story of perseverance and justice. For more than 40 years, Joseph James D'Angelo evaded capture, leaving behind a trail of violence and destruction. His meticulous planning, ability to elude law enforcement, and his dual life as an unassuming family man made him one of the most notorious serial predators in American history. Yet, despite his cunning and his decades-long ability to escape justice, the persistence of investigators and the advancements in forensic science eventually brought him to account for his crimes. The survivors and families of his victims, though forever scarred, stood strong in the face of the evil that had once terrorized them. Their strength, along with the tireless work of law enforcement, ensured that Joseph James D'Angelo would never hurt anyone again. Today, the case of the Golden State Killer serves as a reminder of both the horrors that humanity is capable of and the resilience of those who refuse to be defined by their suffering. D'Angelo may have left a legacy of fear, but the courage of his survivors and the relentless pursuit of justice by investigators ensured that his story would not end in impunity. The Golden State Killer was finally unmasked, and his reign of terror was brought to a close. The terror he spread over the span of 12 years will never be forgotten, but neither will the remarkable determination of those who fought for decades to bring him to justice. Joseph James D'Angelo now sits in a prison cell, stripped of his power, and the communities he once terrorized can finally begin to heal. Top of form, bottom of form.